Welcome to episode 66, our host reflections with our special guest, our initial, host actually is Scott McLeod. We want to welcome you back. Hopefully you will stay with us, if not every episode, but maybe every other episode. And this is just wonderful to have you back. So we have Chris Didi from Harvard, Kurt Bunk from Indiana, Pune Mishra from Arizona State. That will get very hot accordingly. And of course, welcome back, Scott McLeod. And this is our reflection. We've been talking a lot about many, many different ideas. But I want to really invite Scott to give us some reflections, since now you are a full professor. Congratulations. And you've been thinking a lot about, I'm sure, educational technology. And you also have a new book that's come out. So Scott, go ahead.
Wow, thank you so much. It's great to be back. I missed all of you tremendously. And thanks for the kind words about the promotion, just trying to keep up with the rest of you in terms of your fancy titles and endowed professorships and all that, right? So full is just one step along the way. So any of you who haven't heard, I got promoted this summer to full professor, so that's pretty fun. I do have a new book out, and we can talk about that sometime if you want. Pretty excited about that. Reflections. I've been working with a lot of school systems around the country and just really trying to figure out how do we innovate out of the pandemic. And unfortunately, I think we're seeing mostly old wine and old bottles. And so for all the good conversations that are happening here, not really seeing a tremendous amount of movement. I blogged a few months back about this idea that most systems actually won't innovate out of the pandemic, because what happens is that the school leaders are trying to sell a second disruption on top of their first one. And so, we've just lived through this massive 1.5-year disruption of schools. And now somebody who's, some superintendent or principal who's trying to come to their school organization and say, hey, guess what? Let's, blow up school metaphorically and create something different. And I think everybody's just too exhausted. They're just ready to go back to what was. And I don't think they're ready for that second big disruption on top of the first one. So that's kind of what's in my head right now.
Well, Scott, I want to focus a little bit on that. I think today in our reflection, you mentioned something that's really important. That is, we've been talking about a lot of ideas here, 66 episodes. And if we haven't covered every great idea, we've covered quite a number. So tell us about really what schools are facing. I was just reviewing an article from New York Times. All the governors, are rushing back to say, let's return to in-person, education. So what are schools thinking, since you're so connected with the schools?
Yeah, it's hard to say, partly because we're seeing a tremendous amount of superintendent turnover here in the States. So like here in Colorado, like 6 or so of the top 7 largest districts have brand new superintendents, and they're going to come in with new agendas. And I think we're seeing something similar in most states across the US. And so they're just tired of getting hammered by the public. No matter what decision they made, half their community was unhappy with them. So I don't know exactly what emerging out of the pandemic is going to look like. I think we're definitely going to see, some teachers with some new technological skill sets, and hopefully we keep building off of those. I think that we see a number of larger school districts that are trying to figure out how do we keep some of those online and blended options, because they've discovered that a fair number of families are in favor of those. And of course, we have a whole bunch of school systems that have, for the first time, have a device in the hand of every kid. And so I think those are some emerging themes sort of coming out of the pandemic, is what will districts do with new leadership, new technologies in the hands of kids, new modalities of learning that they've started to dip their toe into, and what kind of new structures will emerge from that. And I don't know if any of that will dramatically shift sort of the day-to-day student learning, but we're laying some solid foundations that maybe we can build off of over the next few years.
So guys, I'm going to throw another thing into the picture. I was just, again, reviewing another report that came out of the Civil Rights Office out of the US Department of Education, which really painted a very, very sad picture of COVID-19 and all those. And of course, so which relates to, I think, it's a lot of confusion about COVID-19 versus the remote learning. So is it the fault of COVID-19, but that's painted on online learning. So I was just wondering, Chris, Punya, and Kurt, feel free to jump in to say, again, the idea is to say, where do you think schools should go, at this moment, given what is likely going to be a full return of every children to the classroom? Chris?
So at our last reflection, I did my I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore riff about all the politicians who are saying online was terrible. Thank God we're going back to face, and really blaming every possible learning loss on the evils of the medium, as opposed to incompetence, unpreparedness, et cetera, and also this sort of false nostalgia for a broken face-to-face system. So what do I think would have been a good outcome? And I'm sad that I don't think that we're going to get there. It would have been for people to say, hey, some kids did better online, some kids did worse. Maybe all this research about both and being better than either or might actually be true. Why don't we prepare for both and give people options, teachers and students? And by the way, I'm reading reports that say if COVID doesn't come back, something else may, and then we'll be unprepared all over again, because of all the people who said, oh no, forget all this online garbage. Let's go back completely to face. So it's discouraging. As a program that's attempted to have the theme of learning, the refusal of people, many people, to learn from this disruption is really sad.
So if I can just piggyback on something you said, Chris, which is whether COVID-19, there'll be something else coming, we need to be prepared for that. I think we need to be prepared for COVID-19. I mean, we aren't through this yet. But just before the show, we were talking about, some university, whether it's Harvard or Kansas or Indiana or, ASU, we're going to have 30, 40,000 students back on campus. And if the national averages are the same, half of them are not going to be vaccinated. Then you throw in international students who don't have access to vaccine that they'll be coming in. And these vaccines are not perfect. So even the ones who are vaccinated, a certain 5-10% of them are going to get. So we aren't out of this yet. And we still don't have vaccines for children below 12. That's, the best estimates I've read of that are going to be like August and September. And then of course, then there'll be the ones who, so I think we are not out of COVID-19 yet. And I think that in some ways, forget about preparing for the next one. I don't think we are preparing for this one, even while we are in it, honestly. And this is actually the chance to start doing exactly what Chris is suggesting, which is let's look at what are the various options and possibilities that we can, that we can give to the parents, give to the children, which can find that right balance when some version of it spouts up again in my local community.
But why do you think, everybody, Kurt, feel free to jump in. Why do you think educators and politicians are unwilling to entertain the options that, there are other options, other possibilities, without just necessarily rushing everybody back? Kurt, you want to jump in?
You're assuming that they have a brain. There's all sorts of issues involved in that. I want to go back to the pandemics, the series of pandemics that we've experienced over the last 20 years. When Katrina hit, the state of Louisiana and the state of Mississippi had banned online learning. And at that point, then all of a sudden they allowed it, okay? And during H1N1, all of a sudden the Smithsonian was creating lesson plans for kids that were being used by schools around the country. When Haiti had the earthquake, all of a sudden they got the online Haiti was, fine. When SARS happened, China allowed blended learning and fully online learning from universities that were previously barred from doing it. They only had a select few universities that were allowed to do online learning until SARS. And that was right at the time my blended handbook came out. And that was a permanent thing. Those things were permanent. There are many more examples. I know when we interviewed people at George Mason and George Washington in DC, they hadn't embraced blended learning until Snowmageddon. So these catastrophes have caused a pause in the past for people to rethink the educational delivery. In fact, the state of Ohio is banning snow days. They've got blended learning. They've embraced blended learning for that. If they can embrace blended learning for no snow days, certainly this COVID-19 pandemic will cause some change. I'm not taking the hopeless point of view. I think in the end, with people pushing at it from all sides, including us as a team, and I want to suggest that maybe our team needs to have an episode or two with health educators as our guests to talk about what people can do during the pandemic and post-pandemic and so forth. And I know there's an educator in Indiana that's on CNBC a lot. I could see if I could find his contact and invite him into the show, or if someone else has a healthcare person that they might want to recommend to come in. I mean, Chris, you might know someone in the Boston area that we might want to bring in. Maybe I have a dumb idea. Well, what do you think?
Well, you are expecting Chris to give you an answer right now if it's a dumb idea. I'm sure you won't get that, but actually, over the last few episodes, we've been talking a lot about play, about creativity, about really homeschooling, in many ways, Punya, right? I mean, in the sense to say, children outside the system, and how is that going to grow? And of course, disparities is another issue. My own take is of disparities is that a lot of times we limit kids in disadvantaged families, in disadvantaged backgrounds. We deprive them of the chance to learn online, to connect with people from other places. I think that's another big challenge. But I really want to get onto actually, I want to play the role to ask the question. Again, I want to go back to Scott. Scott, in your new book, you interviewed a lot of school leaders before the pandemic. And do you think they are going to be able to continue what they've been trying to do during this new time, and are they inspiring others to do it?
Thanks, Yang. You're just hammering on me today as your special guest. Awesome. So thanks for the invitation to chime in. So the new book, Leadership for Deeper Learning, comes out in about 2 weeks. And what we did was we identified 30 deeper learning schools around the world that were doing some interesting stuff. And then what we did was we interviewed every principal, and then we did site visits of 28 of them before the pandemic hit. And our driving question was really, what do principals in innovative schools do that's different from principals in more traditional schools? As you can imagine, we saw a lot of really great student learning happening and some really cool teaching happening there. And what we do is in every chapter, we articulate some key leadership behaviors and support structures that we're seeing. And we create a profile of a deeper learning leader in the final chapter and so on. So I'm really proud of the book because it's very specific in terms of not only portraying the kind of learning that's happening, but also the kind of leadership behaviors that are happening as well. And thanks for being an early reviewer of that book and the testimonial. We appreciate it. I think those schools are going to be just fine. I think that what they did was, they were so used to giving kids high levels of agency and ownership over their learning before the pandemic hit, that when all of a sudden kids were at home and they weren't at school and, the teacher reach wasn't as great, they just figured out ways to keep kids chugging along on sort of self-driven learning opportunities. So I'm actually not worried about those schools at all. I think they all are going to appreciate being back in person, because there's some things that they can do in their community in terms of service learning projects and community impact projects and so on, that they just couldn't do remotely. Some of the hands-on applied stuff that required collaborative work together. But I think they're fine. So, and I think—
What do you think are they inspiring others to do it? Do you think that's happening?
So that's the longer arc of history, right? So all of us have been in this game a long time now. And I think that if you look back 10, 15 years, many of us have been talking about the same thing for a really long time. But I think we're seeing the numbers of schools go up. So if we have 1,000 or 2,000 deeper learning schools now in the US, for instance, and several thousand more across the world, that number was half a few years ago. It was a quarter a few years before that, and it was the 10th a few years before that. So I think we're seeing the progression. What I don't know is what's the threshold, right? Like what's sort of the maximum number relatively of deeper learning schools before parents start pushing back and saying that's enough of those kinds of schools. So I may have mentioned this before in an episode that we've had, but like here in Colorado, we're a big school choice state. So you can go to these big districts like Denver and Jeffco and Aurora and whatever, and they have 3 to 5 deeper learning schools that are doing the kind of learning that we all care about. And then they have 95 schools that aren't. And, if you go to them as a parent or a family and say, I want this kind of rich, robust, hands-on, applied, tech-infused, deeper learning for my kid, they're like, oh, well, we've got those 6 schools, go to one of those, right? And so the appetite is not for whole-scale system transformation. The appetite is to give it as a, 5 to 10% option for the families who want it. And then the other 90, 95% of schools will be as we've always known it.
Yeah,
and so there's some kind of level there that we reach where then the system or the families are like, well, that's enough of that.
Thanks. I want Randy today ask our host to think about their own works. So Chris, you and I chatted. You're getting a lot of invitation to present, and I was just wondering, why do they invite you to present if they don't want to accept your ideas? I think that's a reflection we all should think about, right? So Chris, can you reflect on that? I don't know if your audience listen to you, but why do they invite you? Apparently your ideas are liked.
Well, it's hard to tell because am I being invited or is a guy from Harvard being invited? That's really an interesting question. When I arrived at Harvard, my IQ went up 30 points without my being one bit smarter. So there's this halo effect, an unwarranted halo effect, I might add. And so I never know with some of the invitations just what the driver is. But I think that if a speaker can present a contrary point of view in an engaging fashion, people feel like, oh, yeah, let's have balance, right? Let's have balance in the conference by bringing in this contrarian kind of view. And then if anybody says, oh, you're so dogmatic and all the speakers say the same things, that you can say, well, not all of them. Most, yeah, but not all of them. So I don't know. I mean, there's a third hypothesis, which is that I'm just not provocative enough. That if I really said what I thought, I wouldn't get any more invitations. So there's a lot of different possible explanations here for what's going on.
Well, because that's very important, Chris. Don't you think So we can just pass on to Kurt and the Punya, because you guys are invited all the time too. I'm just always wondering, why people invite you when you have a view or you don't have a view. Are they just enjoying your Harvard? I'm sure, Kurt, go ahead. Indiana is not Harvard. It doesn't add IQ to 30 points. Indiana might add 10 points of IQ, right? Kurt, you're on mute.
Oh, no. Now you tell me. God, I thought I got 30 points, at least 15 for being the Big Ten. Come on now. It was getting out of hand a decade or two ago in terms of invites. I was doing over 100 a year and all over the place. And sometimes it was just, they were bringing someone in who could tell jokes. To be honest, I told them I'm not funny anymore. They said, we're not bringing you then, so that's a true story, actually. So people, if they bring people to speak, it's not just to get people to think, it's to be entertained, unfortunately. So I provide the entertainment, and I try subtly providing some pointed direction of where people need to go. So I take advantage of that humor in provoking people, and I'm not afraid to do so. Now, are people willing to change as a result of one talk from me? Probably not. Are they open maybe to reading something in addition to what they wouldn't have? Maybe that's the case. So we can't transform education, but we can make our gentle nudges and our dents in our own respective ways. At least I would hope so. And Chris, in the future of education, which has been one of his focuses for decades, got me thinking. And I saw him early on at conferences, at AERA and other places. And I must say, he made a huge impact on me. So I think he continues to do so, because he's always thinking that next step ahead and trying to synthesize trends in the field. And so we're fortunate to have him in with us on this show, and the people listening to those broadcasts in the archives later. The same with Punya, the same with you, and the same with Scott. All of you guys are thinking about the future and where we're headed. And so, I think that you all are providing an important service to the educational field. There are not many people who are, to be honest. There are not many people like Punya. There's no one like him, and there's no one like Young and all the books that you've provided for the field, and Chris, undoubtedly no one else like him. So we have unique people. And Scott, please hold up your book that's not done yet. Do you have a invisible copy to hold up? Tell us who the publisher is, at least, and give us the title so that people will buy it. What is the title again?
We'll get to that. No,
we're going to get to that. Okay.
So Scott, I'll come back to you, because I want Punya to say this, because Punya gets invited. Hold on. But I'm not. This is by the way. I'm not saying you guys' presentation has no impact. Okay, so like Kurt said, absolutely. Whenever you go to there, you have 500 people, 1,000 people. There got to be one person who is paying attention to you. So there is at least one or two people. So don't worry about that. And I heard Kurt saying about entertainment. Punya and we entertain people together, and many. So, but I want to get your take on this, Punya.
So my thing is slightly different. So my problem with I am regarded as basically, okay, let me put it another way. I'm not invited for the work I do now. I'm invited for the work that I did 15 years ago. And I have moved on significantly from there, but they keep coming back to me for this dang TPAC thing. And it's like, guys, that's just what, and again, I'm not saying that framework is not important. I'm not saying that it doesn't have a place in how you think about integrating technology, all of that. But I think my thinking, and and in a large part due to, I would say, Young and Scott being part of like moving me there. So to give credit where it's due, to start thinking in terms of systems, to start thinking in terms of impact, to think about leadership. I mean, those are things that I came from an ed psych background and design into this space, right? And okay, this happened. So I still keep getting invited for the TPAC. And so my job then becomes, I give them the dollop of TPAC in the beginning, and I move on to things around how do we think about designing systems and culture? Because to me, systems and culture eat technology, have technology for breakfast, right? I mean, you could do as much innovation around technology, and in fact, even with amazing teachers and so on, but if you do not have the broader system and structure in place, it's not going to go anywhere. So mine is a slightly different story in that regard. But I want to come back to something that Scott said, and that's sort of relevant to this point I'm making, which is that those schools and institutions which are already on this path of thinking about student agency, thinking about what are the systems and structures in place to support that, they handle this pandemic very differently from other ones, right? Which I think Chris in some previous episodes you described as like, you know, either with your head in the sand or waiting for instructions from somebody. And so that again is evidence for me of why we need to be thinking in this way. But in my case, it really becomes that I get invited for X and I then drag that whole conversation from X to everything else, which I think now is far more relevant than, again, you know, than just the sort of that technology itself, or, you know, smart integration of technology will do it. It's like, unless you rethink the goals of education, unless you rethink the systems and structures which allow for students to learn, you know, deeper learning or whatever you want to call it, nothing's going to change. So my situation is somewhat different, but I want to flip that question that you asked, Zhao, onto you, because Scott had this little comment there saying we need to make Young answer his own question. He gets invited all the time too. So what's your story, apart from the one person who's listening to you?
Well, I actually have a general perspective to say, unless you speak, no one can hear you. So you basically go there and you expect, well, you pretend everybody listens to you. And, you know, I actually, when I was in Michigan many years ago, Pune, I was feeling like I was doing a political tour. I would have early coffee shop meetings in rural Michigan places. Really, you never know who might listen to you, and you get surprised. You get really surprised by who react to what you say. It's a kind of a fascinating process. And you know, and then of course I think Kurt is right. And you make sure, you know, you are entertaining. You know, that's another thing. I think many people haven't seen many Chinese people, I guess, you know, that's a good thing to be around. And so, you know, so it's kind of interesting. But anyway, so I want to get back to Scott. Scott made some really good points about, we talk too much about what and why, but not enough how. So talk about your book and what do you mean by this how in our presentations? Then I'll go to Chris, actually. I feel like I'm hosting this again, so I feel good. So thank you so much.
I'm sorry, am I supposed to go or is Chris supposed to go?
You. Then I'll go ask Chris.
Okay. So, you know, we have a number of keynote speakers that just sort of travel the circuit and give a good entertaining talk, and they get people inspired or fired up for a few hours or a few days. You know, the work that I'm trying to do is really focused more on the deeper implementation work that happens after. So, you know, Yang, like you and the rest of us, you know, I can give a good keynote talk if you need me to, but it sort of feels pointless if after you leave, nothing ever happens. And so one of the things I mentioned in our internal comments here is that I'm really trying to ask more questions about what the follow-up is going to be. Why are you bringing me in the first place? What are you hoping to accomplish with this talk? How does it fit into your larger goals and initiatives and so on? And then, you know, most of my more recent work has been sort of longer term engagements with leadership teams and school systems, where we're really trying to roll up our sleeves and get at the how of the work. How do we translate the bigger ideas and concepts and, you know, societal needs into day-to-day school systems and practices and leadership behaviors? And that's what the book is really trying to do on the leadership side. So my previous book, Harnessing Technology for Deeper Learning, was really focused on the how around instructional redesign at the classroom level and instructional coaching level. And then this new Leadership for Deeper Learning book, which is going to be published by Routledge, Kurt, and comes out on the 27th of July, is really focused on the leadership side of that equation. What are those specific leadership behaviors and support structures that we have to put into place in order to sort of make these things happen, right?
All right, thank you. So by the way, even though I'm asking you guys questions, I know you all of you have enough agency not to be bounded by my questions. You want to say whatever you like to say. I know that's the case. So whatever question I ask, you can ignore. But Chris, I have another question relates to this. So it's very easy to get mad, and I'm really getting mad at this situation. So when I get mad, I try to write something. And so I'm trying to write an article about, why, you shouldn't stop thinking about online, even when you return to normal. I don't have a good title it. So Chris, back to you. In a sense, you are considered a great leader. You have done a lot of projects in various districts with various kind of foundations, all those kind of things. If Chris, I was going to ask you to highlight, what would you like to see the change? We haven't done this ourselves. So like, in our own thinking, each one of us, what do we want to see the big change in districts? Chris?
Well, I'm going to take advantage of your invitation to answer a different question than the one that was asked. Actually, that's something that full professors and politicians have in common. So it's a good thing to know how to do. And I want to go back to something that Kurt said about you kind of surround the truth with a body of entertainment. And so people get drawn in because of the entertainment. And then there's that grain of truth that you leave in their minds. And often I think paradox is an interesting way to accomplish that. I like very much the writings of G.K. Chesterton, who was a famous British author and speaker about a century ago. He was a contemporary of people like George Bernard Shaw. It was the age of rhetoric. And Chesterton taught me about paradox when he said, if something is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. It kind of, captures that the aphorism actually is off target, and that it forces you to think more deeply about what's going on. So let's go back to what we spent much of what we're reflecting on is a series of episodes that were about play. If we're going to write something, we should write something that talks about learning loss, and it bemoans the learning loss of going back to school, because all of that learning taking place through play is lost. All of that, creative exploration and active learning is lost. The safe place where you're not bullied and you're not treated by people who are biased because you're safe in the nest of your family is lost. Yeah, I'm really worried about learning loss, but not the learning loss that the politicians are talking about, this other learning loss. And so I think a lot of being a speaker that both has a good impact, but also is popular, is finding ways to do that clever reframing that kind of catches people off guard. They think it's funny, but then underneath, they're kind of caught by it.
Chris, I think you actually answered my question. You were talking about learning loss. That is what you care about. I think the other thing is that we got to be very kind of clear and careful is that I was asked a question recently about grammar of schooling. It's been old concept. And they said, well, let's change the grammar of schooling. I said, you can't really change the grammar of schooling. You cannot change the grammar of English into Chinese. If you change the grammar, the language doesn't, it's a different language. If you change the grammar of schooling, then it's no longer schooling. So I've been, saying that teachers, school leaders are really stuck by a large educational system that's built the curriculum, built testing, built accountability, all of those things. You and I were chatting about, why NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, kept focusing on literacy and numeracy and use that to define our educational progress. And you were saying, Chris, that because we want to do comparative studies, so how we compare in 21st century to 1965, how we compare. That's kind of a, because we are all stuck in this. And Scott, your book, fortunately highlights some other big changes. So now I want to go to anybody, Punya, Scott, or Kurt. You guys can jump in to say, what are you thinking about in all your work? Because Punya said, you from your TPAC, which was wonderful, and then now to more system thinking, design. Punya, you and I are still working on a book about how do you design. You and I, we chatted a little bit about that, a few weeks ago. How do we design for play? How do we design for creativity? How do we design for individual agency and responsibilities? I don't know, Punya, if you want to jump in, or Scott and Kurt.
So coming back to this thing of like about speaking, I think for me, the important thing is moving the conversation forward. And that's, I think, my biggest hope is when I go give a talk or something this way, is that whoever I'm speaking to, and I think the use of humor, the use of paradox, all of that, is really, can we move that conversation forward? Because I don't think that change is going to happen overnight, right? I mean, it's going to be incremental, and it's tapping into the right people. And I think it also speaks to like my evolution and growth and change over time as well in my thinking about it. When I started with working with technology, with teachers, that was the main focus. But increasingly realizing that it is this broader, it's the design of the broader systems, and trying to understand how that design can be created, and trying to take what we understand about design, broadly speaking. And so some things like you and I talked about is like, if you want to design for anything, and some of that came up in some of the discussions we had in Silver Lining around universal design and so on, is that you design for the extremes. The famous case study of the peeler, which you're designing so that a grandmother with arthritis can use it, as well as a football player with his big hands. And then the middle will take care of itself. While in education, we tend to keep trying to design for the middle of the bell curve, and we don't understand, so I think some of those principles, thinking about how they can be brought into institutions. And so that's my sort of goal, is can we move that conversation forward? Because I am reasonably skeptical about that there will be transformational change that will happen immediately. But really, it is to set people on this path of iterative sort of rethinking, reimagining, redesigning continuously.
All right, I think Scott has a response to that. We just chatted about play. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I remember something that Chris Lehman, the principal of Science Leadership Academy in Philadelphia, said a few years back. He was talking about some work that his secondary students were doing, where they were playing around with some scientific stuff. And what it eventually led to was they were trying to figure out how to do biodiesel conversions in a different way. And they were testing out new generators in a couple of villages in like Guatemala that didn't have steady electricity access, right? And so the thing that really resonated with me from my conversation with Chris is that he said, we didn't know where that work was going to end up. We just started playing around, and eventually it turned into this awesome international project where we were working with partners in another country to try and provide electricity in a different way, in a more efficient way, and so on. And there's just not a lot of room in schools for that kind of sort of play or inquiry or divergent learning, where we don't really know what the outcome's going to be. We are so standardized, we're so focused on control and compliance. Where are the opportunities for true open-ended inquiry and experimentation and play, where we don't know where we're going to end up, but we know we're going to learn some good stuff along the way? There's just not, most schools aren't set up for that.
Kurt, yeah, you want to reflect on that a little bit?
Sure. Going back, I think that in terms of all our speaking engagements, we're the most creative when we're preparing for them. We're pushing ourselves when trying to come up with something different. We're reflecting on all that we've read and trying to synthesize it, to help others out. I think just coming up with a title and an abstract for what you're going to say is often a creative experience. One of the often a daunting challenge, especially when you're exhausted, to come up with something new. But it's kind of where many of my ideas are born. It's in the writing process when you're doing that book, Scott. And so every invite's a chance to be creative. And I try to take advantage of that. And it's a huge challenge to always change something in your talk or have something in your reports or your papers, your manuscripts that is a creative burst of energy, a new model, a new figure, a new phrase, whatever it happens to be. And so my two books that are very practical in nature, activity books, one's R2D2, read, reflect, display, and do, and the other one's adding tech variety, and tech variety's 10 principles of motivation. And that tech variety book, I had colleagues grab me and have asked me to help them on a TESOL book for teachers of English as second language, and that's coming out in a couple of months. So we're going to have a spin-off version of that book. So you never know where other ideas will kind of populate from. Last week I gave a keynote to Israel and 2 to Korea, and the Korean ones, they wanted me to speak about X, Y, and Z, and then I transitioned into, as Chris said, you transition them into getting to think in broader terms. And I had a really great experience with the U.S. Embassy. Actually hired me for the second go around, and many of the teachers came to both, and so I was happy. It wasn't just a one-off experience. They came to a second one, then they wrote me an email, and so it could maybe springboard into something. And I know, Punya, I know, Chris, you've been invited back to things over and over and over again. So maybe not just the first time you're going and meeting with these people, it's a second time, it's a third time, and it's all systemic. It's not just what you are providing as a speaker, but who you can recommend and who you can bring in and resources you share. And it creates kind of a new language for them to talk about, a structure for them to talk about. And so I try and create frameworks. I try and create models to make sense of the masses of information that's coming at them every day, and saying, no, you don't have to read everything. Think about it from the standpoint of a framework or a model or something else. So that's my take on it, and I've been sort of successful in doing that. And there are times when I feel really stale, and I say, when am I going to come up with what happened, and then you get on a plane, it's the last 2 minutes as the flight's landing, pops in your head, or at the end of a run when I'm jogging, all of a sudden something new pops in my head, and you write it down real quick and you elaborate on it. You talk to Punya, I call him up on the phone, I got this idea, and he says, oh, I don't know. So you talk to your colleagues and you grab them for lunch, and one thing goes to another. So, being a person who's invited to a lot of talks enables you to be creative, enables you to have an impact. And so going back to Scott's notion of making impact as well, implementation is important. In fact, Scott, is your publisher Daniel Schwartz at Routledge, or is it someone else there at Routledge? Is it Dan as your editor, or no?
No, somebody.
So Dan changed my title of my new book, my next book, from Making Impact to something much longer. That's, but anyways, I'm still calling the preface Making Impact, and the conclusion chapter after Making Impact. It's all about making impact, right? And how we go about making that impact. And so right now, why I'm a couple minutes late coming up here and joining you guys, I was trying to write the ending chapter, at least a piece of it. So I'm in the throes of all that right now. So this conversation is good for me.
Kurt, I got to stop you there, because one thing, what you said actually was relates to something, and also Chris said something. I really want to spend the next 15 minutes for you guys to think about what we talked about the last 3 episodes. We had creativity, we had play, we had self-regulated learning, and largely is about freeing people to pursue what they can do. And I think it was like Scott was talking about, it's not making students to follow what you prescribed for them, but rather to liberate them from the required. I had an idea. There was in this country, in the U.S., the federal government says we forbid any discrimination against people based on their origin of nation, sex, all those kind of things. But there's no discrimination. There's no forbidding of discrimination against people based on cognitive interest. So, I think schools in many ways force people to say, you have to learn this, that others, parents have to pay. So I used to think I should sue my school districts because my daughter, I have to pay for her to dance. How come other kids learning math did not have to pay? The school district should offer dancing for free, or singing. If my kids go there, why would you highlight literacy and numeracy? Why not something else? So that's what I think. The 3 episodes talks a lot about self-regulation, and can you be self-regulated based on what your interests are? Go ahead. Anybody?
So, yeah, I want to, and thank you, Zal, for bringing. Because I had a little note here, wanting to bring back to those 3 episodes, which focused on sort of participatory creativity and then self-directed learning and play in some order. And I think I want to connect it to the comment that Scott has here, which is that play is open-ended and divergent, and most schooling is standardized and convergent. And I think the tension that happens there is that if we take a playful participatory creativity approach, if that's what we emphasize, it can't be something, can't be something that we just give lip service to and not participate in ourselves, right? I mean, this is the famous thing that I always used to have with most educational psychology courses, where we would get lectures on constructivism. So if you truly believe that students construct their knowledge, then you can't be giving a lecture about it. That is self-defeating, right? That it is coming back to Chris's idea of a paradox. That is a good paradox. It is a snake biting its own tail. And so I think that, and that's where it comes back again to me, to systems and culture. Because unless you have a culture within which risk-taking is okay, a culture which says, let's try this, we don't know where this is going to end up, but hopefully, we will learn a lot along the way, that unless your organization is that way, there is no way it's going to come into the classrooms. There's no way it's going to allow the students to do that, because otherwise the students will try something new and some policy or structure will say, oh, no, they cannot do that, right? And that to me is the single biggest challenge. And again, if you look at the institutions which did well, and we have had some of those guests on our show from the very beginning, there were ones which had embraced that, either a culture of design or a culture of action research. There was this sort of playfulness to it. There was this willingness to take a risk, which I think becomes critical to this piece. And I think those 3 episodes for me didn't focus on the school system side of things, but laid the foundation, in my thinking at least, of what are the necessary components that we need to be thinking about structurally if we expect that to happen within classroom or learning contexts. And absolutely, Scott, the point, I think maybe you can follow up with what you just wrote here.
I mean, so much of this boils down to brave leadership. And so what happens is that as soon as we start trying some different things and it runs into some community opposition, our principals and superintendents mostly back down rather than, making the case and seeing it through. So, this is
Scott, hold it there.
Sure.
Do you think it's brave leadership? Do you think requires some courageous followership? Do you think a brave leader can have enough followers whichever district he or she might be in?
Yeah, absolutely. This is all ally work, right? It's how do you start building a community of allies and a critical mass of people who's ready to do something different and is willing to take the time and energy and space to figure it out, because we're not going to be good at it at the beginning. And again, we just don't have enough of that. So.
Okay, Kurt, Chris, you guys want to react to the previous episodes or whatever was said?
Well, I want to react to what was just said about brave leadership. Maybe schools should be like restaurants. Now, there are some restaurants like Chick-fil-A, right, You don't go to Chick-fil-A and get a beef sandwich, right? I mean, you get what they have, and if you don't like it, you go somewhere else. That's really what a lot of school districts are like. It's one size fits all. But a successful restaurant that's broad has something for vegetarians, it has something for people who like sweet and sour, it has something for people who like meat and potatoes. And nobody yells at the owner of the restaurant because somebody else is eating vegetarian, as long as they can get beef. So I think part of the problem with district leadership is we should think of districts like an ecosystem. And however many parents want active, playful learning, hire that many teachers. However many parents want children's primary knowledge of technology to be the sundial, hire that many teachers too. And let it be an ecosystem, and that gets the leader into a different set of responsibilities, which is figuring out what people in the community want and letting them have it. And then hoping that over time, people will decide that they like, they like what their neighbor's kid is doing. And so maybe they're going to switch sides and take that kind of a teacher too.
So, Chris, I confess that I struggle with that idea. It's the one I talked about earlier, where there's some 10% of families or students who want this rich, robust, innovative learning that prepares them for the 21st century global innovation society. And the other 90% of families don't want that. And I think, what happens in a school district is that when you offer those kind of choices, is that certain families will take advantage of those choices and certain families won't. And then, of course, what happens is we run into equity issues and speed of change issues and so on. So, but I don't think that we can simultaneously bemoan the lack of progress of systems towards different kinds of learning and then also say, well, we're going to go really slow and we have this little safety valve option over here for the few of you that want it now. Because what happens is that 90% of the kids and families never get future-ready learning.
But if it's really 90% in the district, they control the school board and throw out any superintendent that doesn't give 100% of the students what 90% want. I mean, there are problems both ways.
Sure.
But I don't think that you can say the key to success is taking what 90% of people don't want and somehow making that happen, because that just is a guarantee for being thrown out.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that, but then we shouldn't bemoan the slow speed of change.
Well, that's what I think my challenge is that in education, whenever we talk about a change, we think our version of the change should be 100% covering all schools. What I hear from Chris was saying, more trying to be selective, which is I like. I always said, called school within a school. You just build many options. If you're a brave leader, a courageous leader, you build many options for this group of parents, this group of kids, this group of kids. I think in society, and if you run a school like Denver or like Chicago, that's a huge district. You can run many options for many different parents. But now, of course, our government, the state and the federal, always has one view, like Chris, you were saying, one size fits all. Whenever that especially is wrong when you get to the idea about equity. When we talk about educational equity, we're expecting everybody to get the same test scores on the same subjects. It's really stupid, but that's how we drive that. I think we need to shift all of those thinking. Punya, looks like you're ready to jump in.
No, I was just nodding my head and I was making a comment there. So
yeah, okay, Kurt, you want to?
This is all I have to say is this is Zhao's Chinese background coming through about the let 1,000 flowers bloom. So just have to make that joke.
Kurt, go ahead.
I two things in terms of the last few shows. Number one, we should thank Punya for putting together, and you, Young, because you helped, for putting together marvelous 3 shows, and you all get a deep round of applause because it harkens back to a year and a half ago or so, or a year ago, when we talked about having themes. and this was maybe the second time we were successful in having themes. You know, we had some environmental shows early, and maybe had some other themes on the global south, whatever, but this is really truly was a thematic month. So I want to challenge us, someone, to think about looking ahead, and if we could have another run of 3 shows like that, it'd be really great to do.
I have an idea. I want to follow up, if you don't mind my interrupting. Scott, can we get 3 or 4 leaders who you think would, from your book, to come to the show? I think that would be, and that sort of connects with the theme that we had talked about, I mean, an idea that we had talked about before, that it's time to revisit maybe some of the people who we had invited before. But I think this sort of follows that, which is people who you think have focused on deep and learning, leaders who have, and some educational leaders who are in practice, you know, who were trying new things before the pandemic and have seen opportunities in the pandemic to continue that work. I think would make a fantastic series of, you know, 3 episodes or something that way. You know, and since you have done this groundwork, and I'll make a special background with your book cover on it to pitch the book. How about that?
You know,
If that doesn't sell it, nothing else will.
Sounds fun.
sounds great, Scott.
Kurt, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I got 40 authors from mostly Fulbright scholars, award-winning teachers from around the world, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, China, Korea, and whatnot, that I could run a series of 3 shows too based on that. They're all talking about how they're making an impact with instruction, with critical and creative thinking strategies and motivation in their respective countries. So some interesting stories. I'm sure we'll come up with some.
Yeah, I think I would love to get some of those teachers you have, but I think I've read Scott's book. It's really truly a wonderful book. I'm sending this for you. And the schools you have there are truly wonderful. If you want to co-select with me, I'll be happy to do it. You know, I think for each episode, we can have 2, and then we can do 6 people and 3 episodes. It's truly wonderful. And some of those schools, I wouldn't call them very deep, but most of them are deep to, you know, they can draw on you, you know, they're deep enough, but not everyone is deep as each other. But anyway, so yeah, Pune, a great suggestion.
Yeah, I think if we can get like a diversity of schools within there, you know, I mean, that to me is going to be interesting, is like that. And it goes back to this May 1,000 flowers bloom idea, which is that these flowers are going to bloom in different ways. So I think getting a diversity of approaches, diversity of techniques, and, you know, strategies or whatever, I think would make some really good episodes.
Well, I would love to get also some really bad schools. You know, if you know some really bad schools, I'm not joking, seriously, if I'm sure if you get students, parents, or teachers, I mean, really just to think about, you know, we kept thinking, oh, you know, like people say, oh yeah, that school, their teachers are low quality. But really, what do you mean by low quality? You know, do they really not care about the students? You know, we also have this very racist view of, some groups, you know, their parents just don't care about their children's education. I don't, you know, myself, I doubt that's the truth. So I think there's a lot of things we can come down to deal with this. I was wondering if anyone has final words to say before Kurt gets introduced next episode.
Scott, remind us when that book is coming out.
July 27th. So, and thank you.
Make it July 28th. That's my birthday. Make it July 28th.
I'll call the publisher, Jan.
Yeah.
Hey, Scott, great to see you. Congratulations again on the, I spell it as FOOL, Professor, but that's just me. But great to see you again. Thanks for joining.
All right, Kurt, next episode.
Well, we're blessed with another UK visitor coming next Saturday, and it's at 11:30 Eastern Daylight Times, or 4:30 in the UK. And the blog post is just ready to roll out, so it'll probably be up in a couple of hours. Jilly Solomon from the UK, I met her in Leicester when she was the head of the media zoo. And so if anyone who names her center a zoo, you can imagine she's a really fun person. She thinks a lot in metaphors, and she's known for her 5-stage model of online learning for e-moderating and e-tivities, but recently is talking a bit about Education 4.0 and about the 4 possibilities for the post-pandemic world in education. And I won't give it away what the 4 are, but it's in the title of the blog post. So you'll have to read that blog post, and you can get this article by scrolling down to the bottom of the blog post, and the link is in there, along with a link to a 6-minute video from Jilly Salmon herself explaining her perspective on this change and what's possible in the future. She was the Pro Vice Chancellor at Western Australia and at Swinburne University in Southern Australia, in Melbourne, but now has come back to the UK. So she's done a number of interesting things. We'll go off in a number of different directions. She's also worked for the Open U in the UK, like Mike Sharples, who we had last week or 2 weeks ago, a week ago. So I welcome you into our show next week. Thank you.